The floorboards complained softly when he stepped on them, as if the cabin itself were rousing from a long, uneasy sleep. Dust motes drifted lazily through the beams of morning light, seeping in through the small, square windows. Everything smelled of cedar, damp paper, and the type of silence that feels older than memory. Eli Turner hadn't planned on staying long. Just enough to sort through his father's belongings, sign a few papers, and lock the place for good. But grief has a way of slowing the hands on the clock, and the cabin, with all its stubborn stillness, seemed to swallow time whole. He knelt near the old writing desk where his father had once typed draft after draft of novels he never published. Dozens of folders sat inside the bottom drawer, their tabs yellowed and curling. Most were filled with half-finished stories, crossed-out ideas, abandoned outlines, and the occasional poem written during sleepless nights. Eli lifted them carefully, as though any abrupt movement might disturb whatever thin layer of meaning remained on these fragile pages. Behind the drawer's wooden track, his fingers brushed against something rough, out of place. He pushed the desk slightly and leaned down. One of the floorboards was warped, lifted on one end, as though someone had pried at it long ago but never fully removed it. For a moment, he debated ignoring it. The cabin had plenty of creaks and imperfections. This was probably just another sign of age. But then a familiar curiosity tugged at him, the same itch he had felt as a child when he watched his father write deep into the night, refusing to share what he was working on. He wedged his fingertips beneath the raised plank and lifted. A hollow breath exhaled from the darkness below. Nestled in the narrow cavity was an object wrapped in a brittle piece of cloth. He pulled it out gently, feeling the weight of it immediately, not heavy in mass, but heavy in presence. The cloth disintegrated along its edges as he peeled it back, revealing a faded leather journal with stitching that had begun to unravel. Its cover was cracked like dried river mud, its spine softened by time. There was no lock, no clasp, nothing to suggest it was meant to be hidden, and yet it had been buried beneath the floor like a secret that needed to stay cold. Eli sat on the cabin floor, knees bent, journal resting between his palms. His father had never been a private man, not in the way that required hiding things. He had always been open, approachable, steady. To find something that Mark Turner had deliberately concealed unsettled Eli more than he expected. The air inside the cabin shifted, becoming denser, almost expectant. Outside, the trees whispered in the wind, their branches tapping lightly against the glass, as though urging him to open it. He did. The first page crackled as he turned it. The handwriting hit him instantly, sharp, tilted, unmistakably his father's. At the top of the page, neatly written in ink that had faded to a bluish gray, was a date, August 1980. A shiver moved across his shoulders. August 1980, the year of the Vermont family vacation, a trip his father had spoken of only once in Eli's entire life, and even then in vague, clipped sentences. A trip Eli barely remembered except for soft fragments. The smell of pine needles, the cold bite of a mountain lake, the way the station wagon rattled on unpaved roads. His father had been 29 then. Young, hopeful, a man with dreams still untested by life's weight. Eli tried to imagine him writing these pages at the cabin they had rented. Maybe late at night, after everyone else was asleep, or maybe long after the trip, when memories had twisted into something too heavy to hold. He read the first few lines carefully. They were ordinary at first, almost deceptively so. Notes about packing, about the long drive north, about the kids falling asleep in the back seat. But beneath the surface of the words, something trembled, an undertone he couldn't quite identify. The handwriting wavered faintly in places, as though written during moments of hesitation or fear. Eli turned the next page and found a small dried leaf pressed between the sheets. It crumbled when he touched it, leaving faint brown dust on the paper. Had his father placed it there intentionally, or had time done that on its own? The question lingered unanswered. He kept reading. Then abruptly, halfway down the third page, there was a line that made him stop cold. I don't know how to describe the feeling, but something was wrong even before we arrived. It was small at first, like a quiet pressure at the back of my mind. But I can't shake it. Eli swallowed hard. He reread the sentence, as if expecting the ink to rearrange itself into something safer. but the weight of it only grew heavier. His father had never spoken of fear, not the genuine kind that seeps into your bones. If anything, Mark Turner had been the anchor of the family, the person others leaned on during storms. To hear fear in his words now felt like hearing a stranger speak with his father's voice. A slow unease crept up Eli's spine. He felt the cabin around him shift again, subtly, as though it understood the journal had been found and was waking from its long slumber. The wind outside picked up, brushing the pine branches against the window pane in slow, deliberate strokes. He turned the page again. Another date, another entry, and beneath it, a sentence that changed the temperature of the room. If anything happens during this trip, I hope someone finds this. Eli's breath hitched. The words seemed to pulse on the page, heavy and deliberate. If anything happens, someone finds this. This wasn't a diary of memories. This wasn't a writer capturing inspiration. This was a man documenting something he feared might never be spoken aloud. Eli closed the journal gently, but the silence afterward felt louder than before. He rested his hands on top of it, grounding himself, trying to steady the thudding of his pulse. He hadn't expected this. He had come to empty the cabin, to box up old manuscripts and outdated clothes. But now, sitting on the floorboards his father once walked across, he realized he had uncovered something far older, far deeper, and far more fragile. A secret, a warning, a story his father had hidden under floorboards, perhaps hoping it would never be found, and yet knowing inevitably that someone would open it someday. Eli exhaled slowly. He looked toward the woods outside the window, where the trees swayed in unison like silent witnesses. For the first time in years, he felt the echo of that forgotten summer rising up inside him, tugging at loose threads of memory. Whatever happened in Vermont in 1980, it was here, waiting for him, and now there was no turning back. The memories come back softly at first, like distant lights blinking through fog. Eli sits at the small kitchen table with a journal open in front of him, but to understand what his father wrote, what he left hidden, he knows he has to rebuild the world these entries came from. He closes his eyes, letting the faint hum of wind against the cabin walls pull him backward in time. Not to the fear, not to the mystery, at least not yet, to the sunlight before the shadows. Before Vermont in 1980 became a story of secrets, it was simply a family vacation. Or at least, that's how everyone pretended it would be. He remembers his father from that era through photographs more than memory. Mark Turner with a mop of slightly overgrown brown hair, a teacher's easy smile, and a habit of pushing his glasses up with the side of his knuckle. He was 29 and carried himself with the sort of optimism that came from believing life still obeyed intention. Mark loved lesson plans, handwritten notes, and the simple stability of routines. He was adventurous, not by nature, but he treasured the idea of curated adventure, a planned drive, a reserved cabin, a week of nature he could step into and then safely step out of again. Eli's mother, Laura, was different. She had a softness that people often mistook for quietness, when in reality she was full of currents running beneath the surface. Her laughter was light, musical, something that could fill a room without effort. But she lived with restlessness too, a kind of longing that sometimes made her eyes drift toward distant things, even when she was sitting among her family. She loved art museums, garden centers, late-night radio plays. She collected postcards from places she hoped to visit one day, though she rarely left their small Massachusetts town. Then there was Aunt Vivian, the opposite of both of them. She arrived in every room like a spark snapping through dry air. The kind of woman who made strangers smile without knowing why, who spoke too quickly, felt too loudly, and lived as though the world were a series of moments meant to be tasted before they evaporated. She was Laura's younger sister by 3 years, and Mark's mirror opposite in temperament. Where Mark methodically arranged road maps, Vivian threw her jacket into the back seat and declared the destination irrelevant. She had a new hairstyle every season, a new passion every month, and a new story every time she appeared at their door. And then there was Sam, 10 years old in 1980, 2 years older than Eli, bright, sharp, endlessly curious. A boy who ran everywhere instead of walking, who collected rocks, coins, bottle caps, anything small enough to pocket and important enough to him alone. Sam had a protective streak, especially with Eli, even when they were young. He stood slightly too stiff in photographs, as though trying to hold himself in place before the world could move without warning. The family, on paper, looked unremarkable, just 4 people heading north for a week's escape. But even before they left, things inside the house felt quietly misaligned. The night before the drive, Eli remembers his parents speaking softly in the kitchen after they thought the children were asleep. Their voices rose and felt like fabric pulled too tightly. He doesn't remember the words, only the tension. His mother's sentence breaking off abruptly, his father's footsteps pacing, a chair scraping, a long silence that felt heavier than the argument itself. But by morning, everything was painted over with bright enthusiasm. His father loading luggage into the station wagon with exaggerated cheerfulness. His mother double-checking the cooler, making sure they had berries and sandwiches and a thermos filled with her herbal tea. Vivian arriving with sunglasses pushed into her hair and a camera around her neck, announcing she was spiritually overdue for a forest. Sam racing down the driveway, shouting that he had dibs on the window seat. Eli remembers sitting in the back, pressed between a pile of blankets and his brother. The sun flashed across the windshield in rhythmic patterns as they drove north, through small towns, past farm stands with hand-painted signs, along winding roads lined with maples and birch. The landscape felt like it was opening itself for them, offering a week away from routines, from expectations. But even in that joyful movement, there were small cracks that a child's mind noticed but could not understand. His father's fingers tapping anxiously on the steering wheel. His mother staring out her window longer than necessary, her reflection caught in the glass like a person looking at someone else's life. Vivian checking her watch too frequently, as if waiting for something. Sam quieting down whenever the grown-ups' voices shifted tone. The closer they came to Vermont, the clearer the air became, crisp, almost unnervingly clean. The car windows fogged slightly from the change in temperature, and when they rolled them down, the scent of pine and cold water rushed in. It should have felt refreshing. Instead, Eli remembers a strange tightening inside his chest, as if the woods were drawing closer not with welcome, but with intention. Mark's journal, in the passages Eli now studies, paints a glowing picture of these days. He writes about playing roadside games, about stopping at a diner for pancakes, about how vibrant the sky looked above the highway. But between the lines, if you read slowly, you can sense a man trying to convince himself that the trip began in peace. A man carefully constructing a memory that would make sense later. A man who wanted to believe, desperately, that nothing was wrong yet. But it was clear something had already begun before they crossed the Vermont border. Something small, something quiet, something that lived in a way they avoided certain topics and filled silence too quickly. The vacation, on the surface, was supposed to be about togetherness. But beneath the surface, the Turner family was carrying something unspoken, something heavy enough that even the most beautiful landscape couldn't fully hide it. Eli can almost see them now. Their silhouettes framed in the car windows, sunlight tracing outlines around their heads, each of them staring ahead with their own private thoughts. They looked like a family heading toward a postcard-perfect getaway. They were, without realizing it, heading toward the story hidden under the floorboards. The cabin appeared slowly between the trees, as though it had been waiting for them all along, half concealed by pines that grew so tall they seemed to cage the sky. Eli remembers it only through fragmented childhood impressions, a porch railing chipped by weather, a roof that looked too heavy for its beams, the smell of wet bark. But through the journal's descriptions, the place rebuilds itself in sharper focus. The Turner family arrived in the late afternoon, sunlight slanting through the forest in long golden threads. The air felt cooler here, thinner, touched by the scent of moss and river stones. Their station wagon crunched over the gravel path as they pulled up to the clearing. The cabin stood at the center of it, small and slightly tilted. Its wooden siding faded to a soft gray. A narrow chimney rose from the roof, though it didn't look sturdy enough to withstand a real storm. And yet there was something undeniably inviting about it. Quiet, proud, resolute. The kind of place that made you think of old letters, hand-carved furniture, and nights spent listening to the woods breathe. Mark's journal describes the arrival in gentle, admiring detail. He writes about the way sunlight flickered across the cabin's windows, as if trying to peek inside. He writes about Sam leaping out of the car before the engine even stopped, running toward the lake visible through the trees. He writes about Laura stretching her legs, lifting her face toward the sky with a small, relieved smile. But even in these warm recollections, the journal holds an undertone of unease, so faint that it's easy to miss unless you're looking for it. Eli reads the paragraph twice. His father had written, "It felt like a place untouched by noise, but not untouched by memory, as if people had been here before us and left something behind. Not physical, but emotional, suspended in the air." The line seems innocuous until you notice the slight hesitation in the phrasing, as if he sensed something, even then, but didn't yet understand it. The first hour at the cabin had the usual chaos of unpacking. Vivian claimed the smallest bedroom, saying it felt cozy in a storybook kind of way. Laura inspected the kitchen cupboards, opening each one slowly as though expecting something surprising to fall out. Mark carried luggage inside, mentally comparing what he saw to the listing he'd received from the rental agency. He was the type to notice details: loose nails, mismatched furniture legs, the faint smell of old smoke trapped in the curtains. He mentions these things in the journal with mild amusement. But Eli can't help feeling that his father was cataloging them with purpose, as if something about the cabin already made him wary. The lake behind the cabin shimmered through the trees. The water was still, almost glass-like, reflecting the retreating sunlight like a second, quieter sky. Sam stood at its edge, looking out across the surface with an expression Eli could never fully remember, but somehow feels now. Part wonder, part anxiety. The mix of emotions experienced by a child who senses more than adults assume. Bird song echoed through the clearing, but beneath the chirping and the rustling branches, there was an odd silence, an absence, not a natural quiet. The kind of silence that makes your ears feel like they're straining for something they can't name. Mark wrote about it, though indirectly. One entry notes, "It's peaceful here, but the quiet feels too complete. Even the wind seems to know when to stop." A sentence that could mean nothing or everything, depending on what was to come. Inside the cabin, time seemed to stretch. The interior smelled faintly of pine resin and damp wood. The living room had two mismatched sofas, both sagging in the middle, and a stone fireplace filled with ash that looked months old. Dust coated the edges of the bookshelves, which held a few forgotten novels, a broken lantern, and a map of local trails tacked to the wall. The floorboards creaked unpredictably, each step creating a small symphony of groans, as if the cabin were stirring from a long, dreaming slumber. Vivian immediately opened the windows, proclaiming the air inside too stale. Laura found a vase and placed wildflowers in it, an attempt, maybe, to anchor the space with something living. Sam discovered a loose board near the back of the porch and stomped on it repeatedly, fascinated by the hollow sound it made. Mark, according to the journal, walked slowly along the perimeter of the cabin, inside and out. He describes testing the door hinges, checking the windows, examining the lock on the porch entrance. Not out of suspicion, he writes, but habit. Yet Eli notices something else in the way his father documented the surroundings, an almost compulsive attentiveness, as if he were preparing himself for something. Night approached gradually. Shadows thickened between the trees. The last rays of sunlight retreated from the porch, leaving the cabin washed in early dusk. The family gathered for dinner. Simple food cooked over the small stovetop. They ate with the windows open, letting the smell of pine drift inside. Everyone was tired from the drive, but the conversation was light. Plans for the week were made. Hiking trails, lakeside picnics, a visit to a nearby village. It all sounded so ordinary. But then the journal shifts tone in a single, almost offhand line. "I don't know why, but as I watched the kids eat, I suddenly felt a strange pressure behind my ribs, like something here knew us already." Eli stares at the sentence for a long moment. It is such a quiet observation, no drama, no certainty, yet it holds a seed of everything that would unravel over the days to come. That first night, the family settled into their rooms. The cabin creaked as the temperature dropped. Leaves rustled outside. The lake's surface caught the moonlight in a pale shimmer visible through the window. Eli imagines his father lying awake, eyes fixed on the ceiling beams, hearing the woods whisper, writing mentally, storing impressions in the place where sentences are born long, before ink touches paper. The Turner family slept in a cabin wrapped in pines, unaware that the darkness beyond the windows was already shifting into the first shape of a mystery that would cling to them for the rest of their lives. A cabin that looked peaceful in daylight. A cabin that breathed differently when the sun went down. A cabin that held its own stories long before they arrived. They had been in Vermont for only 2 days when the first intrusion into their quiet routine occurred. Small, almost forgettable in the moment, yet unmistakably the point at which something outside the family stepped into their story. In his journal, Mark writes about it with the care of a man trying to remain objective, but the tremor in his descriptions reveals how deeply the encounter unsettled him. It happened during a late morning hike. The day was bright enough that the forest floor looked dusted with gold. Sunlight dripped through the trees in shifting patterns, and the air smelled of cedar and damp leaves. The Turner family set out on a beginner's trail that looped around the lake and wound toward a clearing near a ridge. The guide map of the cabin described it as gentle terrain, ideal for families, and Mark had chosen precisely because it seemed safe, predictable, an antidote to whatever unspoken tension had been floating between the adults since they arrived. The trailhead stood only 10 minutes from their cabin, marked by a wooden post with a peeling green arrow. There was no one else around. Even the small parking area held only their car. Eli, reading the journal now, paused over the way his father emphasized that detail. The emptiness, as if noting it for the record in case it mattered later. They walked for nearly half an hour before they reached the section where the trees thinned and the path widened into a flat stretch of packed soil. Birds called intermittently from high branches, and the breeze moved through the leaves with a soft, rhythmic hush. It should have been peaceful. Then Sam, who had been skipping ahead, stopped abruptly. His small figure stiffened. He looked toward the right side of the trail, where the forest grew denser. Mark wrote, "At first, I thought he'd spotted a squirrel or a deer, but he wasn't excited. He was still. Too still." A moment later, a man stepped out from between the trees. He emerged quietly, as though he had been standing there long before the family arrived, and simply decided to make himself visible. He wore a faded red flannel shirt, well-worn hiking boots, and a canvas backpack that sagged heavily on one side. His hair was dark and slightly matted, as if he had been outside for many hours. His face was lean, angular, with features that looked almost carved by the sun and wind. There was nothing overtly threatening about him, nothing dramatic. And yet in the journal, Mark describes him with a strange hesitation, as though trying to capture why the sight of an ordinary man felt so deeply wrong. The man offered a nod, polite, but strangely slow. "Morning," he said. Laura returned the greeting. Vivian offered a casual smile. Sam drifted back toward his parents without speaking. Even at that age, he sensed things adults often dismissed. Mark's account of the conversation shifts in tone depending on the sentence. On the surface, the stranger was friendly enough, chatty in the way locals sometimes are with tourists. He asked harmless questions at first. Was this their first time in Vermont? Were they enjoying the cabin? Had they visited the lookout point yet? But then the questions grew specific. "Which cabin are you in?" he asked, his voice light, as if the answer didn't matter, though it clearly did. Mark hesitated before replying. He mentions his hesitation in the journal, as if ashamed of how instinctively cautious he suddenly became. Before he could answer, Vivian jumped in. "The one by the West Ridge. Just for the week." Something flickered across the man's expression, brief, unreadable, and then came the second strange question. "Are you all here together?" It was phrased innocently enough, but the wording felt wrong. Most people would have asked, "Is it just the four of you? Or are you here as a family?" Not that. Something about it implied he was checking, confirming, cataloging. "Yes," Mark answered after a moment. "All of you," the man repeated, almost softly. Eli feels a chill each time he rereads that line. His father had underlined it twice in the journal, a rare emphasis for a man who seldom annotated anything emotional. The stranger smiled again, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Nice spot up there," he said. "Real private." It should have been a compliment, but it sounded like an observation, a fact he had known long before the Turners arrived. There were small, unsettling details that Mark only noticed later, once fear had sharpened his memory. He writes about them scattered through a few lines. The man's boots were muddy in a way that suggested he had been walking off-trail for quite some time. His nails were slightly dirty, as though he had been digging or moving through wet soil. His backpack had no obvious camping gear, though he claimed to be hiking for the day. He also never asked the family's names. He acted like he already knew them. When the conversation ended, the man offered a final nod and stepped back into the trees. Not onto the trail, not toward any visible pathway, straight into the forest, where the branches closed behind him like a curtain. For several minutes, no one spoke. Sam eventually broke the silence. "I don't like him," he whispered. Laura tried to soothe him, brushing his hair back, suggesting maybe the man was simply odd or lonely. But the journal captures what Mark thought privately in that moment. Sam wasn't the type to fear strangers. It was something else, something deeper. They continued the hike, but the mood had shifted. The air felt heavier. The forest, which moments earlier seemed alive with gentle sound, now felt too quiet, as if listening. Eli reads on. The journal's tone changes here, tightening. His father admits he kept glancing over his shoulder for the rest of the trail. He wasn't scared exactly, more aware, hyper-tuned to every sound, every crackle of leaves. He wondered if the man had circled around, watching them from another angle. Vivian, usually oblivious to tension, stayed unusually close to the group. Laura walked with her arms folded tightly across her chest, a gesture Mark later realized she often used when she was worried but trying to appear calm. When they reached the ridge and paused to look at the lake below, the beauty of the landscape felt complicated, still breathtaking, still vast and serene, but now laced with an undercurrent of unease. The feeling that the forest around them was no longer neutral, that it had been awakened to their presence. Mark ends this entry with a single unnerving line. "It was the first moment I felt we were not alone here." Eli closes the journal for a moment, letting his breath settle. His father had been a measured man, not prone to dramatics. For him to admit this, even in private, meant the feeling must have been overwhelming. The stranger by the trailhead had appeared without warning. He had asked the wrong questions in the wrong tone. He had watched with too much focus and left with too much silence. And the Turner family, though they did not yet understand it, had already stepped into the shadow of something that would follow them to the days ahead. Something that would begin with curiosity, but end in loss. The nights in Vermont had a way of stretching, pulling time thin until every sound felt amplified, every silence felt intentional. During the day, the cabin seemed harmless, aged but gentle, worn in the way old places are. But once the sun dipped behind the trees, once the last fingers of light withdrew from the windowsills, an unease settled over property as naturally as dew. And it was at night, in that quiet thick with shadows, that the first fractures inside the Turner family began to widen. According to Mark's journal, the change began subtly. The first 2 evenings passed with the kind of tired contentment that comes after long walks and fresh air. Dinner was simple: soup, toasted bread, sliced fruit. They talked about which trails to explore next, about a pair of deer Sam claimed to have seen near the lake, about the peculiar smell of pine sap warming under the sun. It all seemed normal. But on the third night, the atmosphere shifted. The entry begins softly. "I woke around 1 in the morning. No reason. The cabin was quiet, but too quiet. The kind where you feel your heartbeat louder than anything outside." Eli pictures him sitting upright in that narrow bed, listening. The cabin breathing. The woods holding their breath. Mark wrote that he got up to get a glass of water. As he passed the living room, he noticed a faint sliver of light slipping out from beneath the door of the room Vivian and Laura were sharing. It wasn't unusual. They often stayed up late talking on trips, sharing secrets the way sisters do. But something made him pause. Something in the tone of their muffled voices. He stepped closer. At first he heard only the rhythm, sharp, overlapping whispers. Then a phrase drifted out with accidental clarity. "Not now, not here." Another whisper, Laura's voice this time strained. "You promise." The journal does not describe what Mark felt as he stood there listening. But the way he recounts the moment suggests a complicated knot of emotions: confusion, suspicion, fear, the uncomfortable awareness of a truth being kept from him. He writes carefully, as if choosing each word to avoid revealing too much even on paper. It was not a conversation of sisters reminiscing. It was urgent, emotional, like something was being held together by threads. He didn't knock. He didn't confront them. He went back to bed and pretended to sleep, though he didn't close his eyes for a long time. The next morning, the air felt different. There was tension around the breakfast table, not spoken, but palpable. Laura moved with a distracted slowness, her gaze drifting to the window as though searching for something in the tree-line. Vivian was unusually quiet, fidgeting with her sleeves, her usual brightness dimmed by a kind of inward pull. When Mark asked if everything was all right, both women answered too quickly, their voices overlapping before they settled on the same word. Fine. Sam noticed it too. He kept glancing at the adults, sensing the shift the way children sense storms long before rain hits the ground. The journal's next few entries become increasingly introspective. Mark writes about trying to dismiss what he overheard, telling himself it was probably nothing, an argument about home, about finances, about some trivial matter that had rolled into their vacation. But the uneasiness remained lodged in him. He became more observant, more attuned to small things. He noticed Laura avoiding Vivian's eyes at certain moments. He noticed Vivian stepping outside alone more often, pacing near the tree-line with her arms crossed, as if wrestling with a decision. He noticed that whenever Sam or Eli asked where she was going, she responded too vaguely. Just some air. One night, as the family sat around the small living room reading or sketching, Mark caught a moment he could not shake. Vivian was staring at the window, not out of it, but at it. Her expression was tight, her posture tense. Laura saw her, and their eyes met. Something unspoken passed between them, something that made Laura's hand tremble slightly before she set down her mug. Mark didn't write what he felt watching them, but Eli imagines a realization beginning to take shape in his father's mind, that the trip was carrying more than luggage, that there were things happening beneath the surface, secrets, regrets, long-held tensions, that had nothing to do with hiking trails or quiet lakes. The nights only deepened the cracks. The cabin groaned when temperatures dropped, but on the fifth night, Mark describes hearing something else, something that didn't belong to wood or wind, a whisper of movement outside, followed by a soft tapping on the porch railing. He sat up in bed, heart pounding, listening to what he could only describe as footsteps that weren't footsteps. Something pacing lightly, pausing, breathing, or perhaps just the forest settling. He wasn't sure. He wanted to wake Laura, but she was already awake, sitting on the edge of bed, her silhouette rigid in the moonlight. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. She didn't answer. She only looked toward the window, her profile carved in silver. The silence stretched too long before she sighed and said, barely audible, "Go back to sleep." She sounded tired, but not the kind of tired that comes from lack of rest. A deeper kind, emotional exhaustion mixed with fear. Later that same night, Mark got up again. As he walked down the hall, he saw the light under the sisters' door once more. Another whispered argument. The same odd desperation. He leaned closer. "Vivian, we can't keep pretending. Not here. Laura, please, we have to. For now." The phrase "for now" hit him hardest, because it meant something was waiting, something they expected to unfold. He wrote in his journal, "I realized then that I wasn't imagining it. Something followed us here, not in the woods, but within us." In the morning, everyone behaved as though nothing happened. Smiles that didn't reach their eyes. Forced cheerfulness. Plans for the day made too brightly. But cracks, once visible, never disappear again. They only grow, widening with every unspoken sentence, every uneasy glance, every half-made explanation. This section of the journal ends with a line that Eli reads again and again, trying to decipher its weight. "I thought the cabin's quiet was unsettling, but it wasn't the silence outside that scared me. It was the silence between us." The nights of whispered arguments marked the beginning of the emotional unraveling. And though Mark couldn't have known it then, those hushed exchanges were the first warning signs of a storm that would soon consume their trip, their certainty, and their family's future. The morning of Sam's disappearance began like any other. Soft blue-tinged light filtering to the cabin's windows, the smell of dew still clinging to the porch steps, the forest waking in slow breaths. Nothing about that day announced itself as different. No omen, no strange sound, no sharp shift in the air. If anything, it was one of the most peaceful mornings they had experienced since arriving in Vermont. And perhaps that was the most unsettling part of all. Mark's journal opens this section with a long, drifting paragraph about how still everything felt at dawn. He described stepping outside with a mug of coffee, watching mist rise on the lake in thin ribbons. He writes of the faint hum of insects, the gentle rustle of leaves, the soft plinking sound when a fish broke the surface of the water. It reads almost idyllic, almost too idyllic, like a memory polishing itself to hide what came next. Sam was the first to grow restless that morning. 10-year-old energy can fill a forest faster than any birdsong. He tugged on his sneakers, stuffed his pockets with smooth stones he insisted were lucky, and begged to wander near the shoreline while the adults prepared a late breakfast. Mark hesitated for a moment. He always hesitated with Sam, not out of distrust but out of protective instinct, but eventually agreed, reminding him to stay within sight of the cabin. Sam nodded. "I know, Dad." He always said it that way. Soft, steady, like he wanted to reassure everyone that he was careful, responsible, older than he looked. Laura watched him go with a faint crease between her eyebrows, but when Mark asked if something was wrong, she brushed it off. "Just tired," she said. "That's all." Vivian was quiet too, unusually so. She drank her coffee on the porch, arms wrapped around herself, eyes fixed on the tree line. When Sam waved at her from the path leading down to the lake, she managed to smile, though it flickered. The journal notes a particular detail here, one that Eli reads 3 times before moving on. Mark wrote, "He left with such lightness. I didn't know that was the last moment of normalcy we would ever have on that trip." What happened afterward unfolded slowly at first, so slowly that no one noticed the subtle shifts. Breakfast was nearly ready. The smell of sizzling butter filled the kitchen. Mark was slicing apples when he realized he hadn't heard Sam's voice in a while. Not the crunch of his sneakers on gravel. Not the splash of stones skipping across the lake. Just nothing. Laura must have sensed it too. She drifted toward the window, gaze sharp, searching for movement along the water. Mark joined her, scanning the shoreline. At first it didn't seem unusual. Maybe Sam was crouched behind a boulder, inspecting a frog or a cluster of mushrooms. He often lost track of time when something caught his interest, but minutes ticked by, too many minutes. Mark stepped outside and called his son's name. His voice echoed across the lake, but returned unanswered. He called again, louder this time. Vivian put down her mug and stood abruptly, her eyes narrowing with alarm. Laura came to porch railing, her hands gripping the wood until her knuckles whitened. "Sam!" Mark shouted. Nothing. The journal's pacing quickens here. Sentences shorten. The handwriting grows slanted. Mark describes how his chest tightened, how a coldness swept up his spine. He moved toward the lake at a near run, scanning every rock, every shadow, every patch of tall grass. His mind raced through possibilities, each one worse than the last. He reached the water's edge, breath uneven. The lake was calm, its surface mirroring the sky. Too calm. No ripples, no movement, nothing to suggest a child had been there moments before. Vivian searched the left side of the path. Laura moved right, though she hesitated as if afraid of what she might find. Mark shouted again, voice cracking. He described the sound as unnatural, like hearing someone else use his throat. 10 minutes passed, then 20. No child can disappear in an open lakeside clearing without some trace. Yet Sam was simply gone. At this point in the journal, Mark's writing becomes fragmented. Ran into trees, no footprints. How could he get far so fast? He knows the rules. He wouldn't hide. Something isn't right. Eli reads these fragments with a sinking feeling. He remembers being told once, years ago, that his brother wandered off for a little while. Nothing more. Nothing frightening. Just a momentary lapse. But this was not a simple wandering off. After nearly half an hour, fear began to take shape. Real fear. The kind that makes breathing feel like a chore. Mark described shouting until his voice cracked, sprinting up and down the shoreline, pushing through bushes thick with brambles, calling Sam's name with every breath. Laura froze in one spot, staring into the distance as if expecting her son to materialize from the shadows. Tears shimmered in her eyes, but she didn't move. She whispered, "No, no, no," over and over, her voice trembling. Vivian was the one who snapped into action, running deeper into the woods, shouting wildly, brushing past branches that left thin cuts on her arms. She called for Sam with desperation, as if shouting loud enough could anchor him back into the world. An hour passed. It felt like a lifetime. Then, just when panic reached its breaking point, they heard a voice. A small voice, faint cracking. Sam's voice. "Dad." The sound came from the far side of the clearing, where the trail dipped downward toward a cluster of thick pines. Mark sprinted toward the sound, stumbling over exposed roots. He found Sam standing alone in the shadow of a tree, his clothes slightly damp, his hair matted, his expression dazed. Mark describes dropping to his knees and pulling his son close, barely able to speak. Relief hit him so hard he felt dizzy. But something was wrong. Sam didn't cling back. He didn't cry. He just stood there stiff, eyes unfocused. "Where were you?" Mark asked, voice shaky. Sam blinked slowly. "I was following him," he said. Mark felt a coldness ripple through him. "Him who?" Silence. Sam's gaze drifted toward the woods. Then he whispered, almost inaudible, "He wanted me to see something." Mark pressed further, but Sam shook his head, refusing to explain. He looked frightened, not of the woods, not of being lost, but the memory itself. When they returned to the cabin, Sam sat in silence for the rest of the day. He jumped at small sounds. He kept glancing at the windows, as though expecting someone to look back at him. Mark notes, "I have never seen my son look that way, like he had walked towards something he should never have seen." He tried countless times to get the truth out of Sam, but the boy shut down. The only consistent detail he offered, whispered once while clinging to the hem of his mother's shirt, was, he said not to tell, whoever he was. Sam refused to describe him. Not his face, not his voice, not where he came from. And in the days that followed, Sam never returned to the lakeside alone. He avoided the path entirely. Sometimes at night, he woke up crying, not screaming, not talking, just crying with quietness that broke something inside his parents. This section of the journal ends with a sentence that chills Eli more than anything else. "I do not know what my son saw, but I know this. Whatever it was, he did not find it. It found him." The disappearance was temporary, but the fear it planted would last far longer, and it was only the beginning. The morning Vivian disappeared was the kind of morning that should have been forgettable. Soft light, cool air, the world settling into its routine with gentle predictability. Nothing sharp, nothing alarming, nothing that should have marked the day as the one that would change the Turner family forever. And maybe that is why the memory of it hits Eli hardest now. Because it came without warning, without drama, without even the courtesy of a final word. According to the journal, it started quietly, too quietly. The sun filtered to the cabin like it always did, slicing thin gold lines across the wooden floor. Mark woke to the smell of coffee already brewing, which meant someone, almost certainly Vivian, had risen early. She was the only one who consistently beat the dawn, claiming the morning air made her feel more like herself. He wrote, "A strange calm filled the cabin, the kind that feels arranged rather than natural." Laura was still asleep when Mark slipped from bed. He stepped into the hallway, expecting to hear humming from the kitchen, Vivian's habit. She always hummed tunes she never remembered afterward. But that morning, there was no sound at all. He found the coffee pot full, steam still curling upward, but no mug, no spoon, no sign someone had poured themselves a cup. The air had that unsettled quality of a page turned mid-sentence. Mark called out for her once. Then again, no answer. At first, he didn't worry. Vivian often wandered off to sketch, take photographs, or walk the trails before everyone else woke. She loved the lake, the forest, the feeling of being swallowed by quiet landscapes. She'd sometimes vanish for an hour or two, returning flushed and breathless, full of small observations, a rabbit trail, a patch of mushrooms, a shaft of morning light that looked like it was pointing at something only she could see. He tried to believe this was the same. But the uneasiness from the previous days, the whispered arguments at night, the changing expressions, Sam's disappearance and mysterious him, lingered beneath the surface like a bruise. And when Mark checked her room and realized her jacket was still hanging on the peg, her boots still beside the bed, and only her camera missing, dread coiled in his stomach. Vivian never left without her jacket, not even in summer. He writes, "A coldness slid through me. Something small but sharp. Wrong." Laura woke soon after. Mark told her quietly that Vivian had gone out early. She nodded, though her face tightened. Not fear, not yet, but concern that bloomed too fast to hide. She said nothing more, as if speaking too much might break the illusion of normalcy. Sam sat at the table, pushing around pieces of toast without eating. He looked pale, drained from his earlier ordeal. When Laura mentioned Vivian's name, he flinched slightly, though he pretended he didn't. Mark wanted to go after her immediately, but he forced himself to wait, to give her time, to trust her independence. An hour passed. Then, too, by mid-morning, the sun had risen higher, burning the mist off the lake. The day's warmth pressed in. The forest grew louder with insects and birds. But there was still no sign of Vivian. The moment when worry turned into fear, true fear, came when they found her footprints. Or rather, when they found where they stopped. Mark describes this part of the journal more erratically, sentences leaning almost as if they struggled against the margins. He had gone searching for signs of her path along the trail near the cabin. The soft soil made prints easy to follow. At first, it seemed ordinary, her familiar boot marks heading outward, turning gently down the slope toward the denser woods. But then, at a point where the trail forked, the footprints simply stopped. Not faded, not overlapped by other prints. Stopped. The ground ahead was soft enough that any step should have left a mark. But there was nothing. The forest floor looked untouched. He circled the area repeatedly, heart pounding, calling her name louder each time. His voice bounced off trees and returned to him sounding thinner, weaker. Laura arrived moments later, her face white, breath shallow. She stared at the abrupt end of the tracks and whispered something Mark couldn't fully hear. Something like, "No, not again," though she denied saying it later. Sam trailed behind them, quiet as a shadow. When he saw the empty patch of earth, he backed away with a small, frightened sound, clutching his own arms as if trying to hold himself together. Mark wrote, "I saw terror in my son's eyes, a recognition. Not confusion, recognition." It was then that panic overtook them. They searched for hours, up the slope, down toward the lake, deeper into pines where undergrowth clawed at their legs. Mark shouted until hoarse, his throat raw. Vivian's name echoed again and again, swallowed by the trees. Laura cried quietly as she searched, her fear not frantic but hollow, heavy, full of unspoken weight. Mark noticed she kept glancing toward certain parts of the forest as if expecting something or someone to emerge. Something she knew, perhaps something from those whispered arguments at night. When they failed to find anything, they returned to the cabin and called the local authorities. The sheriff arrived with 2 deputies. He listened, scribbling notes with a calmness that felt almost cruel. He asked routine questions. What time had she left? What was she wearing? Had she ever wandered off before? Vivian's independence became both a comfort and a burden here. The sheriff seemed to believe she might have simply gotten lost or decided to hike farther than planned. "People take spontaneous walks all the time," he said. She might have followed a secondary trail. But Mark knew that wasn't it. He felt a cold pulse of certainty in his chest. The deputies searched until early evening. The sheriff followed shortly afterward, leaving the family with the usual instructions. Stay near the cabin, conserve energy. They'd continue searching in the morning. It all felt wrong. Mechanical. Empty. After they left, the cabin fell into a silence, so thick it felt like a presence. Laura sat on the couch, hands trembling. She stared at the floorboards, not crying, but hollowed out. Mark approached her gently. "We'll find her," he said. But she didn't look up. She whispered, "I'm scared it's not the forest that took her." Mark didn't understand what she meant. Not then. That night, the cabin felt different. Even the walls seemed tense, as though leaning in. Mark, unable to sleep, sat at the table and tried to make sense of the day. He replayed every detail. Vivian smiled the day before, her distant mood, the humming that never came from the kitchen that morning. Then he wrote something Eli has to read twice to absorb. I think she was afraid of something before she left. I think she knew. The journal grows darker from here. Mark confesses to thoughts he never spoke aloud, suspicions he kept to himself, trying to protect his family from spiraling fear. He wrote that he hadn't forgotten the man they'd met on the trail, his strange questions, his too slow smile, his way of appearing from nowhere. He wondered if Vivian had seen him again, if he had followed them, if she'd gone to confront him or escape him. But another possibility crept in, one that scared Mark more. What if she didn't go to him? What if she was running from something else? Eli closes the journal for a moment, letting the gravity of these words settle. The disappearance of Vivian was not just a missing persons case. It was a collapse of whatever fragile structure the family had been holding together. It was the moment their world diverged. The moment fear became something they could no longer outrun. And though they didn't know it yet, it was only the first irreversible fracture in a story that would never be whole again. Vivian never returned that night, and the forest, once simply a backdrop, had become something else, a witness, a keeper of secrets, a silent mouth swallowing whatever stepped too far into its shadows. The entries that followed Vivian's disappearance did not appear where one would expect them in a journal. They weren't part of the smooth chronological flow that preceded them. They were not written with the same steady hand Mark used for his day-to-day observations. They were not even attached to the spine correctly. They were folded tightly into themselves, edges creased and thinning, pressed between two unrelated pages, as if hidden deliberately or perhaps urgently. Eli found them only because one corner slipped loose while he turned a page, revealing the faintest glimpse of ink where no ink should have been. These were not the entries meant to be read. These were the pages his father wrote only for himself. He unfolds the first sheet carefully, fingers trembling. The handwriting is jagged, uneven, slanting downward as though written by a man wrestling with something he couldn't contain. The ink in some places has bled slightly, maybe from sweat, maybe from rain, maybe from the stray tear of a man who never cried publicly. The first line hits like a quiet blow. I can't tell them how scared I am. The sentence sits in the center of the page, stark and naked. No lead-in, no introduction, just truth. What follows is fragmented, as if Mark was afraid someone might read it, or afraid no one ever would. He writes about hearing things at night. Not footsteps exactly, not voices exactly, but something between the two. Soft movements outside the cabin, too rhythmic to be wind, too heavy to be small animals. Pauses that felt intentional. A weight in the air like breath against glass. He confesses that the night before Vivian vanished, he thought he saw someone standing near the tree-line. Not a shape, not a shadow. Someone, a figure, still, watching. He dismissed it as imagination until the next morning she was gone. Eli feels his pulse rise as he reads. Mark never mentioned this part in the main entries, never told the sheriff, never told Laura. These pages were a confession. He was never ready to speak. Mark writes, I tell myself it was a trick of the light. I tell myself that. But something in me knows I'm lying. He goes on to describe the arguments he overheard between Laura and Vivian, how they weren't petty sibling disagreements, but something urgent, fearful, calculated. He admits he leaned against their door the night before the disappearance and heard his wife say, Don't involve them. Not the boys. Not Mark. And Vivian's reply, strained and shaking, I didn't tell him. Not everything. I swear. He writes in the margins. Wouldn't she tell me? What else does Laura know? His thoughts spiral. He begins to question everything he thought he understood about the trip. He wonders if the vacation was not chosen randomly, not a simple getaway, but a deliberate decision, maybe by Laura, maybe by Vivian, to go somewhere remote for reasons they would not explain. He starts to piece together every strange detail. Laura's tension before they left. Vivian's sudden insistence on joining them. The whispered phrase, Not here. Not now. Her fearful glances toward the forest, the way she stared out the window as though expecting someone or something to appear. He writes, this place was not supposed to be peaceful for them. It was supposed to hide something. Then his tone shifts sharply. The entries turn darker, more frantic. He describes lying awake after Vivian vanished, hearing something brush along the side of the cabin. He says it felt like a hand dragging across the wooden boards. Slow, deliberate testing. He sat up in bed, heart pounding, listening as the sound traveled from the bedroom window toward the porch. He didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't wake Laura. He just listened until the sound faded and the night swallowed it whole. He writes, it wasn't an animal. I know what animals sound like in the dark. Someone is out there. But the entries take an even stranger turn. Mart begins to doubt what is real and what is fear's invention. He questions his memory. He questions the long shadows cast by the moon. He questions the creaking floorboards. Were they creaking or were they responding? He questions the cabin's windows. Were they reflecting his face or distorting it? He writes, the silence here is too aware. I feel it watching me. The deepest unease, though, comes from what he writes about Laura. Not accusations, not conclusions, but fear wrapped in uncertainty. He notes how she seems to know something she refuses to say, how she avoids certain questions, how she wakes in the night with her eyes open, staring at the corner of the room as though expecting someone to be standing there. He writes, she is hiding something, not from me, but from me. I don't know if I want to know what it is. Another page unfolds. This one is written differently, not jagged, but slow, heavy, weighted with dread. Mark describes a moment 2 days after Vivian disappeared, a moment he never mentioned to authorities, a moment even he struggled to believe. He walked behind the cabin to check the propane tank. The air was still, the woods quiet, and then he saw footprints, not heading toward the forest, heading from the forest, toward the cabin. One set, deep, slow, close enough to the back door that the final step nearly touched the bottom stair, and the ground was too soft, too recently damp, for the prints to be older than a few hours. He writes, they were the size of a man's. Not mine, not Mark's, not anyone's who should have been here. But what chills Eli most is the final sentence on that page. They weren't there the first time I checked, meaning someone came back, after the search party left, after night fell, closer than any of them realized. He found no more footprints leading away, just those coming in. The cabin, already claustrophobic, would have felt like a trap then, a fragile box surrounded by endless trees. No lock strong enough, no walls thick enough. The last folded page is shorter, but heavier than all the others. Only one paragraph. The writing is almost illegible, as if his father's hand was shaking when he wrote it. I don't think we came here by accident. I think Vivian was running from something, and I think whatever she was running from found us. Eli sits back from the journal, breath unsteady. These entries were never meant for anyone's eyes. Not Laura's, not the sheriff's, not the boys, not even the man who wrote them. They were a man's unraveling, a private descent into fear, doubt, and suspicion as he realized that the forest was not just scenery, that his family was not just fractured, and that whatever happened to Vivian was part of something far older and darker than a simple disappearance. These pages marked the point where his father crossed from uncertainty into dread, where the vacation turned into a haunting, where the truth began to slip beyond reach, and where, even decades later, Eli realizes that some secrets do not fade. They sink deeper, waiting to be found by the next set of hands brave or foolish enough to open them. The storm arrived the way fear often does. Slow at first, almost gentle, gathering itself at the edges of the world until it finally swept in with force no one was prepared for. Even now, as Eli studies the journal, he can feel the shift in his father's writing, the tone tightening, the sentences shortening, the emotional weight thickening like the clouds that began forming over Vermont treetops that final evening. The day had already felt wrong. Mart described it plainly. The air was too still. Even the birds seemed to be listening. A strange heaviness lay over the cabin, the kind that makes every sound feel slightly muffled, as if nature is bracing for something. Laura moved through the rooms distractedly, her gaze drifting toward the windows. Sam clung to the edges of the house, avoiding the lake entirely. Mark tried to keep the day normal, chopping wood, organizing supplies, pretending everything was fine, but beneath his actions ran the steady pulse of dread. Vivian had now been gone more than 24 hours, and each passing minute seemed to tighten the invisible thread around all of them. In the afternoon, gray clouds rolled in over the ridge, low and swollen. Winds gathered strength. The scent of rain thickened in the air. By early evening, the forest felt darker than it should have. The sun hadn't fully set, yet the shadows had already begun to fuse, merging into heavy curtains between the trees. Inside, the tension twisted tighter. The journal entry for this night begins with a single line that seems to tremble on the page. Something broke inside our family long before the storm hit, but the storm made sure we could no longer pretend. As the first rumbles of thunder trembled through the hills, the Turners gathered in the living room. Laura lit a lantern. Sam sat close to his mother, knees drawn up. Mark paced the small room, feeling caged. The wind began slashing against the cabin walls, rattling the shutters. The rain came next, hard, fast, relentless, hammering the roof in sharp, uneven bursts. The kind of storm that feels less like weather and more like a presence. It drowned out everything, except the fear that had been building for days. Somewhere between thunderclaps, Mark heard it, a faint shuffling on the porch. He froze. At first, he thought it was the wind pushing debris around. But then it came again, slower, heavier, deliberate, a weight shifting on the wooden boards. Footsteps, but not the hurried, chaotic kind. These were patient, testing, as if someone or something was approaching carefully. He looked at Laura, her face drained of color. She knew the sound. She had been waiting for it. Sam whispered, "Is he back?" The word struck Mark like ice water. "Who?" he asked, voice cracking. Sam didn't look at him. "The man," he said softly. "The one from before." Mark's pulse thundered in his ears, echoing the storm. He stepped toward the window, but Laura grabbed his wrist. "Hard. Don't," she whispered, voice trembling. "Please." He pulled free anyway. Rain streaked across the glass in jagged rivers. Lightning flashed, bleaching the world white for a breathless instant. In that split-second illumination, Mark thought he saw a shape at the edge of the porch, a figure tall enough to blot out part of the window frame. Still, waiting. Then darkness swallowed it again. He staggered back, heart racing. "I saw someone," he whispered. Laura's eyes filled with fear he had never seen in her before. Not confusion, not doubt, but recognition. "I told you," Sam said, voice barely audible. Thunder boomed overhead, shaking the cabin. The lantern flickered violently, threatening to die with each gust of wind. That was when the scream came, a sound so sharp, so raw, so filled with terror that it didn't seem human. It seemed torn from the air itself. Mark wrote, "It felt like a blade slicing the storm open." Eli reads the sentence again and again. His father never identified the source of the scream, whether it came from deep in the woods from the porch or from someone closer. The journal leaves intentionally vague, perhaps because Mark himself never understood. Laura clasped her hands over her mouth. Sam covered his ears, shaking. Mark stood frozen for a moment, unsure if the scream had been real or an echo from the fear inside them. Another flash of lightning lit the room, and then another sound followed. This one softer, but far more chilling. A long, slow dragging across the porch. A sound like something heavy being pulled. A sound like a hand scraping along the boards. Mark grabbed a lantern and moved toward the door. Laura grabbed his arm again, pleading, "Don't open it," she begged. "Please don't." He had never seen such terror in her. Not even when they thought Sam was lost forever. Not even when the sheriff told them the search was going cold. This was something deeper. Something she knew and could not put into words. Then she said something that froze Mark in place. "Not this time. Not again. Not again." Two words that cracked the entire world open. Lightning illuminated her face, her trembling eyes, the tension in her jaw. "Laura, what do you mean, not again?" he demanded. "What happened? What are you not telling me?" She shook her head, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I didn't think it would follow us here." He stared at her, stunned. "What would follow us?" She didn't answer. Thunder drowned out her silence, rattling the cabin so violently the lantern's flame guttered. The storm pressed in from all sides, filling the gaps in the walls, seeping through the windows with every gust. Then came the knocks. Soft, slow, deliberate, 3 of them. Knuckles, or something like knuckles, tapping against the wood in a rhythm too controlled to be mistaken for wind. Knock. Silence. Knock. Silence. Knock. Sam whimpered. Laura squeezed her eyes shut. Mark stood perfectly still, staring at the door as though it might dissolve if he blinked. He wrote, "I have heard knocks before, but I have never heard fear sound like with being touched." Another flash of lightning lit the porch through the narrow window beside the door. Mark looked, but the storm's blinding brightness revealed nothing. No figure, no face, only the empty boards slick with rain. But something felt wrong. So wrong he could taste the metallic edge of dread on his tongue. The journal grows frantic here. Sentences clipped, slanted, uneven. Shadows on the porch. Something moved. "I heard breathing." Laura knows. She knows. Then, abruptly, the entry ends, ink trailing off midline, as though something interrupted him. But Eli knows the next entry doesn't pick up immediately. There's a gap. 1 page missing, torn cleanly from the journal as if ripped out in panic or shame. Whatever happened next, his father never wrote it down. But something happened, something that left them changed, something that left a scream echoing in their memories. This was a night when fear stopped lingering outside the cabin. This was the night it stepped over the threshold. Even if the door never opened, even if no shadow entered, fear came inside anyway, into their voices, into their silence, into their family. And when the storm finally broke, when the thunder moved deeper into mountains and the rain softened into fragile drips, nothing inside the cabin felt the same. Not the air, not the walls, not the people. Something had fractured, something had been heard, something had been seen. And whatever had approached the cabin that night, it was not done with them. When the storm finally passed, the cabin felt strangely hollow, as if the thunder had shaken something loose inside their lives and left the pieces scattered in silence. Morning came without birdsong or color, only a washed-out grayness hanging over clearing. Mark wrote that he woke before anyone else, unsure whether he'd slept or simply drifted in and out of fear. The house felt bruised. He stepped onto the porch with the lantern still in hand. The boards were slick with rain, but no footprints remained, no scratches, no marks from the dragging sound they had heard. It was as if the night had carefully wiped itself clean. The emptiness was worse, he wrote. Inside, Laura sat rigid at the table, fingers wrapped around a cold mug. Sam stayed curled on the couch, wide-eyed and silent, avoiding the windows. No one spoke about the figure they thought they saw. No one mentioned the knocks. They seemed afraid that saying the words aloud might call something back. By late morning, the sheriff arrived with 2 deputies. Their presence felt too loud in the fragile quiet of the cabin. They asked routine questions, took notes, promised to expand the search grid. But Mark noticed how their confidence had thinned. The storm had erased everything: tracks, scents, hope. When the officers left, the family drifted through the day like shadows. Mark found Vivian's notebook behind her bed frame, drawings of trees, the lake, and then darker sketches near the end, twisted silhouettes at the edge of the forest. He didn't show Laura. As the search stretched into its final days, the cabin's silence deepened into something heavy and watchful. The sheriff eventually returned with softer words, the kind people use when they're preparing you for the worst. Mark wrote only 1 line to summarize it. The world moved on, but the feeling that something had stood beside our walls never left. The weeks after Vermont settled into the Turner household, like a fog that refused to lift. Nothing loud happened, nothing dramatic, just a quiet unraveling that seeped into the corners of every room. Mark wrote, That home didn't feel like home anymore. The walls seemed closer, the air grew heavier, and the familiar routines now felt like imitations of normal life. Laura moved through the house as if carrying something breakable inside her, speaking softly, folding laundry slowly, watching shadows in the hallway as if they could shift when she wasn't looking. She rarely mentioned Vivian, but her silence was shaped like grief with sharp, unspoken edges. Sam stopped sleeping through the night. He often stood outside his parents' door, whispering that he heard someone walking in the hallway. Mark tried to explain it away as nightmares, but even he felt the house listening in a way it never had before. Months passed in that muted rhythm until, one afternoon, Mark found Laura holding one of Vivian's scarves. She pressed it to her face and whispered, "I never should have let her come." Her voice didn't sound like guilt. It sounded like confession. When he asked what she meant, she looked away, unable or unwilling to give shape to the truth she'd been carrying since the cabin. The journal's entries grew sparse after that. Mark wrote about trying to return to normal, only to find that normal had become a distant place. He noted strange noises in the house, drawings Sam made of tall figures in forests, and the way Laura began placing small stones on windowsills, as if following an old rule she refused to explain. Mark's final entry in this section was simple. "We came home, but something came with us." The last section opens in the attic, where Eli closes a journal and sits in a hush so absolute it feels physical. The dust-heavy light seems to thicken around him as he processes the truth threaded through his father's final pages. The house is quiet, but not empty. When he rises, something thin and brittle skitters under his shoe. A torn scrap of paper. His father's handwriting. The missing page was not lost. It was taken. Eli's breath stutters. As he scans the floor, he notices a faint line to the dust, as if something moved without weight, making a path straight to the trunk where the journal had been hidden for decades. A tremor of cold settles along his spine. He moves toward the attic stairs, but a single knock echoes from below. Not loud, not frantic, slow, deliberate. A second knock follows. Closer. He clutches the journal, turning slowly as the attic air tightens. The shadows seem to draw inward, not moving but waiting. He flips open the back cover. A page he hadn't seen before is tucked inside, written in Vivian's handwriting. Her final entry, the night she vanished. "I thought the forest would stop if I left. But it waits. It always waits." Eli barely finishes reading before a third knock rises from the stairwell. Soft, patient, confident. The kind of knock that doesn't ask permission. He backs away, heart pounding, and instead of fleeing, he opens the journal to its last blank page. His hand shakes as he writes, "I'm here. I see you." Step into the light. The attic bulb flickers. Once, twice, then dies. The darkness feels like breath against the skin. And Eli understands. The story did not end in 1980. It merely paused, waiting for someone to read it.